2. My Grave and I in It. The pilot chosen by Fabian Foreman to bring Thomas More from Earth to Astrobe was named Paul. Paul was 2 meters of walking irony, a long, strong, swift man, and short of speech. His voice was much softer than would be expected from his appearance, and had only a slight rough edge to it. What seemed to be a perpetual crooked grin was partly the scar of an old fight. He was a compassionate man with a cruel and crooked face. From his height, his rough red hair and ruddy face, and his glittering eyes, he was sometimes called the Beacon. For a record of irregular doings, classified as criminal, Paul had had his surname and his citizenship taken away from him. Such a person loses all protection and sanction. He is at the mercy of the programmed persons and their killers, and mercy was never programmed into them. The programmed killers are inhibited from killing a human citizen of Astrobe, though often they do so by contrived accident. But an offender who has had his citizenship withdrawn is prey to them. He has to be very smart to survive, and Paul has survived for a year. For that long, he had evaded the remorseless, stiff-gaited killers who followed their game relentlessly with their peculiar stride. Paul had lived as a poor man in the barrio and in the 10,000 kilometers of alleys in Cathead. He had been running and hiding for a year, and quite a bit of money had been bet on him. There was always interest in seeing how long these condemned can find a way to live under their peculiar sentence, and Paul had lived with it longer than any of them could remember. And he was ahead of those stiff killers. He had killed a dozen of them in their brushes, and not one of them had ever killed him. An Ansel named Rimrock, an acquaintance of both of them, had got in touch with Paul for Fabian Foreman. And Paul arrived now, remarkably uncowed by his term as fugitive. He arrived quite early in the morning, and he was already in possession of an idea from the Ansel of what the mission was. "You sent for me, Hawkface?" he asked Foreman. "I'm an irregular man. Why should you send me on such a mission? Send a qualified citizen pilot. Keep yourself clean." "We want a man capable of irregular doings, Paul," Foreman said. "You've been hunted, and you've become smart. There will be danger. There shouldn't be, since this was decided on by the inner circle of the Masters, but there will be." "What's in it for me?" "Nothing. Nothing at all. You've been living in the meanest circumstances on the planet. You're intelligent. You must have seen what is wrong with Astrobe." "No. I don't know what's wrong with our world, inner circle Foreman, nor how to set it right. I know that things are very wrong, and that those who use words to mean their opposites are delighted about the whole thing. You yourself are a great deal in the company of the subverters. I don't trust you a lot. But you are hunted by the killers. You slipped them yesterday by a fox trick that nobody understands, so you enter the legendary of the High Hunted. There must be something right about a man they hate so much." "We are trying to find a new sort of leader who can slow, even reverse the breakup, Paul. We've selected a man from the Earth past, Thomas More. We will present him to the people only as the Thomas, or perhaps, to be more fanciful, as the past master. You know of him?" "Yes, I know him. That's the time and place and reputation." "Will you go and get him?" "All right. I'll be back with him in 2 months," Paul said, and he started to leave the room. "Wait, you red-headed fool!" Foreman ordered sharply. "You are a man of intelligence. What sort of oaf have I settled onto here? I haven't briefed you. I haven't given you any details at all yet. How will you—" "Don't give it a thought, Grand Foreman," Paul said. He had a crooked, mean grin on his face. How was Foreman to know that the grin was the scar of an old fight, and that Paul's expression could never change much. I said I'd do it, foreman. I'll do it. But what will you go in? How? I'll steal your own craft, of course. I nearly stole it once before. I'd rather have it than Kingmaker's flying palace. There isn't a finer small craft to be had, and there isn't a man I'd rather steal it from than you. And I have to leave in such a sudden fashion, if I'm to leave alive. But I will have to set up contacts for you. I know your contacts. I know those of Cosmos Kingmaker. In fact, I've conned several of them in the past, in my record of irregular doings. I'm a competent pilot in both mediums, time and space. Must leave at once, or there will be some leak to it. I'm no good to either of us is dead. But I will have to get you off Astrobe alive. You're still a marked prey for the programmed killers. I'll die of your kindness, Foreman. I'll get off alive in my own way. But you must have some questions. None. I can find London on old Earth. I can find 1,000 years ago. I can locate a well-known man there. I can bring him back if he wants to come. And I can make him want to come. Paul strolled out, leaped into Foreman's grasshopper, which stood in the open entry hall, and jammed the identification counterpart on it. Then he took flight. The grasshopper, of course, emitted the stolen signal as it flew, and all Foreman's keying of permission could not override that signal. Why did I ever listen to an Ansel and select a wild man like that? Foreman moaned to himself. 10 seconds on the mission and he's done everything wrong. He'll have every guard at spaceport on him. They'll kill him before I can explain. Why did the ruddy fool jam the counterpart? Within seconds, Paul came to spaceport in the grasshopper, and in the same short seconds 3 groups had gathered to deal with him variously. One group, however, had known of Paul's sudden impulsive action some hours before. Paul was thinking rapidly in this, but he also had a friend who was feeding things into his mind. Paul knew that it is sometimes better to have 2 groups than one in pursuit of you. If you can get the bears and the hounds to close in on you from opposite directions at the same time, somebody is likely to get mauled. Luck holding, it may be the bears and the hounds. Having a few bear baiters and hound baiters in ambush, ready to take a hand, may also help. The bears were the spaceport guards, huge and lumbering, reacting to the stolen signal of the grasshopper. And the bears got there first, too fast, or the hounds were too slow. They dragged Paul out of the grasshopper with their grapples, and he knew that they were about the business of killing him. One of them shagged him a bloody swipe that took skin and deep flesh off arm, shoulder, and left ribs, and one, but only one, clasped him to crush him to death. But the primary aim of these bears, these mechanical guards, was to secure the stolen vehicle and clear the status of it. Killing Paul was only a secondary aim. Timing not right, rattled through Paul's head in what seemed his last moment. Other kill is too late. Never was anything late about them before. He was crushed, too tight to talk, almost too tight to think. With the grip that the thing had on him, he would never breathe another breath. But he fought mightily with the iron bear, unwilling to give death an unearned advantage. The hounds were the programmed killers, the same who had been hunting Paul for a year. Stiff and bristling, they now reacted to a frantic signal in their own sensing devices, the escape signal sent out by Paul's actions. Their programming told them that their prey, the Paul person, was attempting an off-world escape from them, and that it was urgent. They closed in on Paul for the kill, blind to everything else, and the spaceport guards, as blindly, reacted to this sudden intrusion into their own area of investigation. The tangle, when it came, was of blinding speed and deafening fury. Here were two different groups of mechanical killers, one programmed for patrol, defense, and counterattack, the bears, the other programmed for stalking and direct assault, the hounds, or hound cats. But a bear was crushing Paul to death, however much the strong and slippery man struggled against it. And yet the crusher was diverted into the churning confusion. Twice it had to stop smash gnashing metal hounds into mechanical death and disarray. Every device there had one or more alarms or sirens or hooters going off inside him, and the signals did not make for clarity. Then was the maddening clash and jangle as the third force entered. Paul felt it in his brain, and both sorts of mechanicals felt it in their gel cells. And there was a direct command in Paul's brain. Breathe, damn it! So he took in one more great breath, having been loosened from the veriest instant. He was too far gone to have known to breathe without being told. But this third assault was a human one, more or less. The voice in Paul's brain was that of Rimrock the Ansel. Whether Rimrock could be called human or not, he was associated with humans. Now Paul also heard the voice of Walter Copperhead, the necromancer who could spook the matrix out of the mechanicals and confuse their programming completely. Paul heard other voices, and he was able to get another breath. Paul was not dead. He refused to die. His crushing iron bear had had to lose him completely to smash down 3 of the mechanical hound cats at once. And the sudden men were in it now. Battersea was as tall a man as Paul and twice as thick. He swung a battle axe that weighed as much as an ordinary man, and he knew where were located the nexus and centers of every sort of mechanical. He'd battered them to death before. Shanty was near as huge a man as Battersea and was faster. Copperhead's powers included the power to disable and kill, and Rimrock the Ansel, of that most gentle species, had nevertheless slicers 3 feet long. Others were there. There was Slider, but Slider had never been sure which side he was on, and Paul himself was into the battle now. He had a long stabber up from a sheath at his loins, and Paul also knew a little bit about how these contrivances were put together. On many of them, an upper thrust below the base of the third center plate will sever communications in the mechanical and leave it helpless, and it was there that Paul thrust. He got it. His thrust severed communications and life. It was a man and not a mechanical that he battled that time, and Paul killed him. A man masquerading as a programmed killer. So there were, the more to confuse the event, human men on both sides. The time is now, the voice of Rimrock the Ansel shrilled in Paul's brains, and yet the silent Rimrock was battling one of the iron bears and seemed not even aware of Paul's location, but Rimrock was a devious fellow. Paul, free again for a moment, bounded like a springbuck and was into Foreman's spacecraft. Foreman had keyed permission, and the identification counterpart had not been jammed on this. Paul was in sudden flight. Well, it had been a curious and bitter battle, quite brief and quite deadly. At least 2 humans had been killed and 6 mechanicals, and the battle will have to explain itself as it goes along, for it is not over. It is to be fought again and again, in its variations. But Paul was free, and in flight painfully swiped and giddy from loss of blood, but in flight beyond pursuit. The programmed killers had Paul on their death list as an enemy of the astrobe ideal, and yet he was now on mission for the 3 big men, the inner circle of the masters, who were supposed to be the mainstays of that ideal. Paul had been whistling happily whenever he had the breath for it, during the whole confused battle in which he had killed a man and demolished a programmed person. He was still whistling happily when he was in flight in Foreman's spacecraft, and none of those in the melee, except the Ansel, had any idea what he was about. And he still whistled, when he was in Hop equation space. It breaks here. It isn't like other space, and persons and things in it aren't the same persons and things they were before. Astrolabe is about a parsec and a half from Earth. Going at light speed, it would take more than 5 years to make the trip, but by Hop equation travel, it could be made in one astrolabe month, a little less than one Earth month, about 700 standard hours. Paul's craft would disappear as it traversed the parsec and a half to Earth. But to the pilot who made the run, it was the rest of the universe that disappeared. To him, there was no motion, no worlds or stars, really no sense of duration or of time in passage. Odd things happened to pilots and passengers during Hop equation travel. During the period of cosmic disappearances, Paul always became left-handed. In addition, there was always an absolutely fundamental reversal in him. He knew from the private jokes of other pilots that this total reversal happened to them also. There was more sniggering about this than about anything else in space lore, for Hop equation travel was very new. But it happened. It happened every time. The total reversal of polarity in a person. Man, what a reversal in polarity. "Oh, well, that's the only way I could ever sing in soprano," Paul would say, as he often did so when in this state. Paul would catnap on the trip, but his state of sleep would register on the craft's instrumentation, and he was not permitted to sleep beyond 90 seconds at one time. He became adept to this, however. Very intricate dreams can be experienced in 90 seconds. Paul calculated that he had at least 20,000 of these memorable dreams during the passage. Each was gem-like, self-contained, perfectly timed, widely different from any other. Each was a short life of its own, many of them with large sets of characters and multitudinous happenings, some completely gentle, some nostalgic for things never known but clearly remembered, some sheer horror beyond the ride of any nightmare. The law of conservation of psychic totality will not be abridged. There were 4.5 years of psychic awareness to be compressed into 1 month, and it forced its compression into these intense and rapid dreams. There's a great lot of psychic space debris, and when one enters its area on Hop equation flight, one experiences it. Every poignant thing that ever happened, every comic or horrifying or exalting episode that ever took place is still drifting somewhere in space. One runs into fragments and concentrations of billions of minds there. It is never lost. It is only spread out thin. The Ansel was in many of the dreams. These creatures are psychically remarkable. They were in the human unconscious before they were found on Astrolabe. There were flashes in and around Paul's dreams of his years of escapes and of the most recent escape at spaceport. Paul was never terrified in moments of danger. His terror came later in dream form, and a lot of it communicated itself on this passage. The several persons and mechanisms who had died in the last episode were in several of the dreams. Persons who have just died are also psychically remarkable. Paul had many dreams of a boy named Adam who died cavalierly in battle again and again, and so avoided the misfortune of really growing up. Dying was the only thing he was really good at. And he dreamed of Adam's sister, a child witch who decided to go to hell before she died. But Paul was not sure whether he had known these two and others previously, whether he knew them only in these dreams or whether he was to know them in the future. And how was it that Adam died so many times? How did he come to life so many times? "No, no," Adam explained. "It is death. It is death. I am not born again. I do not live again. It is always another of the same name. Paul dreamed of the monster Uden, and of his own death when it should come, knowing that he was actually viewing it. But it wasn't all heavy, vital stuff encountered in the passage dreams. Some of it was light and vital stuff. Also still drifting in deep space is every tale ever told. Hey, here's one. It was of an Earthman of a few hundred years before Paul's time, John Sourwine, or Sour John. But now Paul became Sour John, and he told and lived the same time the outre tale. Owing to the diet he had followed from his youth, alcohol, wormwood, green snails, one of Sour John's kidneys had become vitrified, and in a peculiar manner. Not only had it turned to glass, but it had turned to glass of a fine jewel-like green. This he had seen himself on the fluoroscope. It happened that he and some of his friends were at Gazakhan, in what was then India of old earth, and they looked at the great idol there. They were told that the center eye of the idol, an emerald nearly a foot in diameter, was worth $11 million. Sour John went back to his ship and thought about it. Gazakhan is not a seaport, Paul interrupted his dream, for he had acquired old Earth information by psychic teacher machine long ago. Either get on or get off, said Sour John, Paul's other self for the moment. I say it is a seaport. Paul, Sour John, went back to his ship and thought about it. He had always meant to acquire expensive habits, and he could use $11 million. He sharpened up an old harpoon, called the ship's boy, to help him, and in no time at all they had that kidney out. They trimmed it down a little, put it to a lathe, and then a buffer, and one thing and another, and soon they had it shined up to perfection. It was the most beautiful kidney in the world. Then Paul went back to the town, climbed up the idol at midnight. It was 500 feet high and sheer and slick as ice. He pried out the emerald eye and substituted the green kidney. It fit perfectly. I knew it would, said Paul. Then he climbed down, a descent that not another man in the world would dare to make, and went back to his ship with the emerald. He sold it in Karachi for $11 million, and he lived high for a while. But owing to his only having one kidney, Paul was now unable to drink water at all. 3 years later, Paul, Sour John, was back in Gazakhan. He was told that the center eye of the idol had been reappraised. By a miracle it had changed, the people said. It had become richer in color, finer in texture, of a deeper brilliance, and a grand new aroma came from it. Now it was worth $13 million. I figure I lost $2 million on the deal, Paul said as he woke up. 90 seconds. How could that be? The climb up the idol had taken 2 hours at least. Somebody asks what sort of man was this Paul with the permanent crooked grin. He was the sort of man who was visited by a passage dream of a vitrified kidney. 20,000 of such little dreams. Hey, here's another one. Paul was coursing at fantastic speed towards the area where the little twin stars, Rheum and Antirium, revolve around each other. Hurry were his instructions. They seem of no consequence, but they are the governor of the universe. Somebody is tampering with them. Paul continued at his impossible speed and arrived at the area. He saw something that nobody had ever seen before, for nobody had ever been so close to them. The two small stars that revolved around each other were joined together by a long steel chain. It was that which held them in their tight, rapid orbits. It was that which made them the governor of the universe. Paul quickly located the trouble. There was a small green creature with the body of a monkey and the head of a gargoyle, cutting the chain with a hacksaw, and he had it nearly cut in two. Pray that I not be too late, Paul prayed. and he believed he had made it when he saw the sawyer broke a blade. But he quickly replaced it with another, struck his green tongue out at Paul, took 3 more strokes with the hacksaw, and the chain broke. Then Reum and Anti-Reum swung out of their tight orbits, and the whole universe was out of control with its governor broken. 50 billion stars went nova and then blacked out to nothing. The universe had eaten itself and was gone forever. "I told you to hurry," the space captain told Paul furiously as he came barreling up. Then the space captain's face melted like wax and he was gone. "I did hurry," Paul said. Then his own face melted like wax and he was also gone. "Is it quite finished?" came the voice of old hawk-faced Fabian Foreman. "If it is quite finished, then perhaps we can begin to construct a new universe. It's all right, it worked out well. I meant you to be too late." 90 seconds long. 20,000 of them. Each one so different. Oddly, it is only the maladjusted who are able to stand the passages. The well-adjusted pilots crack up on such a solo trip. That is why all Hop Equation pilots are of a peculiar breed. Paul knew that some of the monsters he encountered in the passage dreams were real. They were the weird creatures who live in Hop Equation space. Some of them were encountered by Paul only, but others were experienced by pilot after pilot in the same episode, in the same part of space. It was delirium. Nearly 5 years of psychic experience must be crowded into 1 month. The psychic mass of experience is not foreshortened. From golden Astrobe to blue Earth. Earth is always bluish to one coming from Astrobe. Astrobe always seems gold to one coming from Earth. It is that the whites of the 2 suns are not the same white. White is not an absolute. It is the composite of the colors where you live. Paul made Earthfall, taking it from the morning side, a beautiful experience that never gets old. He came down in London and stabled his craft. He took with him a small but weighty instrument and went to the London office of Cosmos Kingmaker. That richest man on Astrobe had vast interests on Earth also, and Paul knew his way around on both worlds. Brooks was in charge of Kingmaker's London office, and Brooks was immediately flustered by a visit from a man of Astrobe. Most Earthmen are flustered and inferior towards men of Astrobe, feeling themselves left behind and of less consequence. When most of the small but vital elite had gone from Earth to Astrobe 400 or 500 years before, it had made a difference that was never erased. Earth really was inferior, and of less consequence now. Paul presented Brooks with credentials and directives from Kingmaker, and Brooks accepted them. Paul had forged them during the passage, though he could have gotten real ones from Kingmaker himself or through Foreman. Paul liked to do things on his own. "You do not give me much information, and I do not ask much," Brooks said. "I have heard of you vaguely. I know that you have been in trouble on both worlds. Well, I respect the buccaneer in a man. It has almost gone out of us. My master Kingmaker has employed such men before, and it is not for me to question it. Here is the basic machine. I could calibrate an attachment for any period you wish, but you seem to have brought your own attachment." "Oh, that is no great secrecy, Brooks. I've come for a man, and I'll probably leave with him again tomorrow. It isn't necessary that you know the exact calibration, though it would be of no great harm if you guessed it. Here's coin of the period, as my brief here requires me to supply to you. I wish you hadn't requisitioned so much of it. It will strap me. It goes much further than you would imagine. The multiplier is something like 50 to 1. And Paul was fingering the old gold coins around on a little table there. Here, I can use less than 1 in 4 of these, he said. I give the rest of them back to you, Brooks. They are minted a very few years too late for my purpose. They might embarrass me. The men where I'm going would be suspicious of tomorrow coins. And I know the multiplier, and the former and present value. The remaining sum will be about right. Will you come out in Chelsea, Messenger Paul? In Chelsea, you ask? You guess shrewdly for an Earthman. No, I will go in here and come out here. Chelsea at that time was not a part of London. It was some miles in the country. The distance was the same then as now. I may find my man in London on business, or I may find him at his home in Chelsea. Paul stepped through the tuned antenna-like loop, and to Brooks, it was as though the man had disappeared into the crackling air. To Paul, it was going through an unholy grey confusion that is deeper than darkness, and he was sick, as are all who follow the time ravel. Paul came out ankle-deep in mud. He was on the edge of a big sprawling wooden town. He went into a ramshackle public house, ordered and ate woodcock, some very high beef, barley bread, and an onion the size of a child's head, and he talked to the proprietor. Could you tell me whether Thomas Moore is in this city or home in Chelsea? He asked the man, being careful to give the old pronunciation of words as well as he could. Likely at home, the man said. He's out of favour with the king now. You a solicitor? Yes, I solicit, Paul said. You've an odd sound to your talk, the old man told him. Are you from the north? No, from the south, Paul told him. That was true. Astrobe from Earth viewpoint was in the southern celestial hemisphere. It's dangerous to talk to strangers these days, the man said. But I was never one to be intimidated. The old things are passing away, and I hate to see them go. I don't like the new things that are brewing. But I do like Thomas More, though doubting that he'll be long in the land of the living. Mother of Christ, I hope someone can persuade him to leave the country before it's too late. I believe that you're one of them from across the channel. Yes, I'm from across the channel, Paul said, and I'll take him out of the country, if he'll go with me. Do not mention our conversation, and I will not. The king's men are everywhere, friend. Walk in Christ. Paul went out again. It was a cold day. He knew the way, and he followed the road to Chelsea and Middlesex. He was pleased to discover that the English people had not yet become that most unhandsome of people. There wasn't much trouble with the language back in this period, a few little tricks to remember, no more. An hour or two of crisp walking on the road, and Paul was to Chelsea. He asked but once, and then he spotted the man, walking in his frozen garden, wrapped up like a sheep. How did Paul know for sure? Well, he looked a little like the Thomas More of Holbein's portrait, which Paul had studied, but only a little. All portraits by Holbein look more like Holbein than their subjects. But Thomas More was a man who would always be recognized. I am Paul, said Paul as he walked up to him. And after that, I hardly know what to say. Your namesake also travelled far, Paul. Thomas More said with easy friendliness. Not so far as you have, of course, but perhaps to higher purposes. But I salute you, as a man coming through both mediums, which I do not understand. Paul had gone back 1,000 years, and he and Thomas could understand each other, but Thomas couldn't have understood his own great-grandfather. It goes by jumps, and it had changed much more in the 100 years that just passed than in the 1,000 years to follow. It is true that Thomas said naught for naught, that he pronounced of as though it were spelled off and not uv, that he sounded the plural S as though it were an S and not a Z. I don't understand it either, Paul said. But how could you know that I have come through both mediums? You have the aspect of one of them, Thomas said. I've been visited through time before. I'm not a great man, but I'm one who has aroused curiosity in history. Where are you from, Paul? From Astrobe, of which you've never heard. Lay no bets on that, Paul. I've a number of past and future things in my head. Once I believed that travel through time was unnatural, but we all travel through time every moment of our lives. It is only that you have travelled at a different rate and in a different direction. Are all on your world as tall as you? Thomas had a touch of the things that would later be called the Irish brogue and the Scottish burr, but they were in the English of this time. No, the average is about half a foot shorter than myself, about a half a foot taller than yourself, Paul said. To us, you're a short and chunky man, and you've allowed yourself to appear old. I assume it is your natural appearance unmodified, but I'm more and more puzzled that you should guess me so accurately. I didn't get the name of being the best lawyer in Europe without being able to appraise a man, Thomas said. And you are not unique. I told you that I had been visited through time before. By a curiosity of history, I am to have a certain fame. The circumstances of it bewilder me, as they have been explained to me by another traveller. I do not at all understand what is to happen to me within the next year. Other men have been visited from the future, I'm sure, but they're no more likely to publish the fact than I am. Incredulity is a fang that bites deep. I understand that I am to make, and only a few weeks from now, a decision so foolish hardly on the surface of it is hardly to be believed. Visitors have come and asked me why I did it, and I can't tell them at all. You see, I haven't done it yet. The point for which I am to lose my head seems to me to be a trivial one, not worth the loss of a head, certainly not worth the loss of mine. Why have you visited me from Asternick, Paul? From Astrobe. We are in trouble on Astrobe. They're looking for a candidate to lead them out of a hopeless tangle there. They've tried almost every other sort of man. Now they want to try an honest man. They considered the name men, living and dead, of the two worlds. You were the only completely honest man they could discover, or the only man with one completely honest moment. Oh, it will be quite a showy act of honesty for which I will lose my head, Paul. But I can't conceive of myself doing it. I haven't been particularly honest up to this point in my life. Opportune, rather. But if I were honest, or if I am to be so in the climax moment of my life, how will that help you on Astrobe in the future? I've come to take you back to Astrobe with me. You want to take me forward in time with you, Paul? That's impossible, of course. We must live out our lives in our own times and places, according to the fate laid out for us. We cannot tamper with the course of history. A little of the shine flaked off you then, Thomas. It's only a plaything, is it? And not the deep thing? Thomas, that was a silly string of commonplace for an uncommon man to utter, and as a Christian man, you can hardly accept fate. You would make a fine lawyer yourself, Paul. No, I never paid obeisance to fate, and I have just enough natural truculence in me to do it. But I hate to leave my family. Thomas, are you lacking in curiosity, in imagination, in daring? They have called you a forerunner, a man open to new ideas, and possibly you will not be leaving your family. History records that you died on a certain date in an extreme manner and in this realm. Will there be two of me then, Paul? But of course there are two of me and more. Every man is a multitude, but I play with words. Why do you really need me? I've told it. That's because our world is sick. Are you looking for a gaudy cure? You're looking for a doctor snatched from the past. I've failed to cure a sick world here, Paul, and I have watched its sickness growing all my life. It was not even a successful doctor in his own time that you are come for. I was the High Chancellor, Doctor, and the patient has thrown me out of the house. Those who decide such things have decided that you are the man we need. It isn't that I haven't studied the subject, Paul. I once wrote an account of a sick world as I could imagine. You see, my second claim to fame is that I coined the word and the idea utopia. I wrote in bitter and laughing irony of that sickest of all possible worlds, that into which my own world seems to be turning. But here is an odd thing, Paul. I am told by time travelers that my angry humor piece has always been misunderstood. It came to be believed that I wrote of an ideal world. It came even to be believed that I wrote with a straight face. My mind boggles at the very idea. But I'm told that it is so. Paul, there is something very slack about a future that will take a biting satire for a vapid dream. Will you come back with me? Not to any astrobe, no, Paul. I can't help you or yours, you red-headed ogre. I like you, man. There's something pleasant about a really ugly man, and we both qualify. But I can't go with you. I will try to explain. I have asked questions of the time men who have come to question me, so I know a little of several futures. You live about 1,000 years from now, at my guess, at the time of the first Astrobian time of troubles. An astrobe in your time is in wobbly shape, but 1,000 years after you are dead, astrobe will still be in wobbly shape. It will have a different wobble then, however. Astrobe will have long since survived the crisis that worries you now. Crisis is survived only by the doings of one critical man. I know it. Thomas, you are that man. No, I am not. It is another. I begin to recall it now. I hadn't paid too much attention to the accounts of the outer world when I was told of such. It all seemed pretty fanciful. His name, wish I could remember his name. So do I, Thomas. You would surely recognize your own if you were presented under it.
The man who brought Astrobe out of its first time of troubles, and in so left-handed a manner. His name, it will come to me, Paul. That man was quite in heroic mould, and I am not. That man, after he had been shamefully put to the Jerusalem irredentia, cannot be. The name of that man, Paul Misery Michi Domine. His name isn't known. Always he is identified only as the past master. It's a startling thought. You believe him to be me? Yes, I'm sure now, Thomas. You've told me something that isn't known to them there yet. They're still searching for a name to present you under. Past master is one of those they are considering, but they won't decide till they see you. Past master it will be then. The master out of the past is yourself, Thomas. Paul, you also have been pursued for your life, as I have been lately. I know the look of a hunted man, even a defiant one. Surely there are not king's men on Astrobe who hunt down and kill? No, they are different, Thomas. They are programmed, mechanical killers. No, they are the same, Paul. King's men everywhere are programmed mechanical killers. But I see that I will have to discover for myself the name of the real king of Astrobe. Yes, I'll go. Stay the night. I'll go with you in the morning. Thomas, what happened? What is happening to your own world? Paul asked as they talked together that night. You built it according to an ideal of high perfection, but it started to come apart 100 years before this time. Your world is at an end, and another one, in some ways much worse, is beginning. What goes wrong in your world, Thomas? We built it too small, Paul. We built it too small. And really, what is wrong with Astrobe? Can you not give me the name of it? It helps to know the name of your opponent. Its name is the monster Uden, the open mouth of Uden, of whom you have not heard. I'm an educated man, Paul. In my own opinion, at least. I'm one of the handful of men who brought Greek back to Western Europe. History should remember that much of me. And Uden means nothingness. That's the name of him, Thomas. And he has his growing legions. They burned oak and pitch pine and yew in the open fire, and drank a little of the native. In that century, England still had a wine of its own. They were up early in the morning. Thomas More, about to start on a strange journey, went to be shriven. I believe only in spurts now, Paul, he said. My faith is weak. Is it not ironic that I will die for it in the near future, and that those of strong faith will hide and be silent? Paul went with Thomas and did likewise, perhaps the first man to be absolved of sins 1,000 years before he committed them. They went to London afterwards. They went through the tunnel loop and came out in Kingsmaker London office, where Brooks was sleeping on a sofa. He wakened and recognized Thomas at once. I'd guessed it was you he came to take, Paul, he said. I'd rather you took the crown jewels, or the seal, or the charter. If his bones are no longer with us, then we are not the same man. Let's go see, Paul, Thomas said. A man owes himself that much curiosity.
They went to the old church of St. Peter in chains.
You are buried here, Paul said. The church is a reconstruction, but the graves underneath are still there.
An old priest came to them.
Do the bones of Thomas More for certain lie below?
Thomas asked the old priest.
They do. This very year we opened several of the graves. The bones of Thomas More are there, and on one finger bone is the famous signet ring of which you wear a replica on your own figure. You are an antiquarian. No, I'm an antiquary, Thomas said. I have a special interest in this man. What other man, Paul, looks down on his own grave, and he in it? All except my head. I'm told it's buried in Canterbury. Parboiled it, did they not? I'd like to see it, but I suspect that it's too long a journey.
They were going on a journey of a parsec and a half, but 70 miles was too long a journey. As they strolled about London, Paul realized that this man Thomas would never be an anachronism, either on earth or on Astrobe. Thomas was already on to the new pronunciation of the language, to the point of burlesquing it. He was at home, too much at home in this latter world. He did everything directly, and as his right. He got into a fist fight with a bulky young man in a drinking place. Thomas won the fight, too, but Paul saw fit to chide him about it.
Remember, Thomas, you're sainted after you were dead, Paul told him. Saints do not indulge in barroom brawls.
Some do, Paul. Some don't, Thomas maintained, wiping blood off his peculiar nose. Whatever happened to that nose wouldn't matter much. It wasn't a pretty one, but it had a lot of character.
Several men of my acquaintance were later sainted, so I've been told. One of them was a withdrawn man who didn't brawl. One of them was too puny for it, but the third of them did indulge in just such brawls. I've seen him.
And this reminded Thomas of something else.
One thing I forgot to ask, Paul. How's the fishing on Astrobe?
You're silent, Paul. I can still withdraw from this adventure, you know. Answer me, man.
I'm trying to contain myself, Thomas. You will not believe it until you see it. It's one of the great things that have remained great.
You mean it, Paul? You can go out any afternoon and take a string of them.
A string of them? Thomas, you talk like a boy. How can you string fish that are as long as a man? On Astrobe, if you go out in a boat for any purpose other than angling, the fish will rise to the surface about you and howl for the hook. I am glad, Paul, that the New Day fishermen have not suffered any shortening of the tongue. That is what really worried me.
They went to the skyport and entered their craft for Astrobe. Thomas with an armful of mystery novels, revels, bonanzas, and science fiction books, all new things to him. Thomas had also discovered tobacco, and he swore that the stogie was the most wonderful thing in the world since the Evangels. He announced that he would smoke and read for the whole trip to Astrobe. So they enskied. And so it went well, till their first period of cosmic disappearance. He was trying to bellow, the man Thomas. No, the creature Thomas, and his voice was no longer one to bellow with. The fundamental reversal had taken place in him as they made the hop equation trip, and Thomas seethed with a fury that he could not express.
Does it happen to all travelers, Paul?
The Thomas finally asked in frustration.
To all who travel by hop equation journey. The regular trip takes 5 years. What's time to a revenant? I've been dead 1,000 years. That I should live to such shame, he, she, it said.
The passage dreams again, to Paul, and now to the Thomas also. Thousands of them, no more than a minute and a half each, incomparably wild. In passage dreams, Thomas met an oceanic man named Rimrock and did not find it odd. He encountered a female creature who was at the same time succubus, Eve, Lilith, Judith, Mary, and Valkyrie. He dreamed 3 quick, vivid dreams of 3 men he had never met. One man, for his moment, was a spider with a lion's head. One man was a most peculiar fox, and one man was a hawk who sat and shuffled shells at a table, and one shell was different. These dreams sank down into the cellar of the Thomas mind, but they would come up to him again when he met those persons.